For all you professional brewers out there, I'm here to tell you that planning brew schedules is easier than ever with Imperial Yeast, who guarantee that commercial orders up to 20 liters of 4 of their most popular strains will ship free if they're not in stock when you place your order. So in addition to pitching right with the highest quality yeast on the market, they're promising that yeast will be ready when you need it or shipping is on them. A killer deal from an incredible company. Whether you're a pro or a home brewer, if you haven't tried Imperial Yeast in your brewery, it is time to up your game. Check out everything Imperial Yeast has to offer and place your commercial orders at imperialyeast.com. I know I'm not alone when I say that one of, if not the best upgrade I made in my brewing was going from bottling to kegging. I know some people take offense to this, but I promise that is not my intention at all. I just hate bottling, so I credit kegging to some degree as keeping me in the hobby. Of course, as much as I like kegging, it comes with its own set of issues, one of which is making sure the beer being transferred into the keg from the fermenter is exposed to as little oxygen as possible. You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and in this episode, I'm joined by contributor Cade Jobe to talk about a method many use to reduce cold side oxidation when kegging beer.
Yeah, this one's going to be fun. This is the impetus for this experiment is kind of interesting too. It came to me as I was watching a barrel transfer at the brewery. Beer that we had barreled that were going into kegs and that whole carbonation process and how oxygen comes in. So this one's going to be a lot of fun to talk about. I think it's got application to commercial as well as homebrew stuff as well.
Yeah. If I've learned anything in the 18 years I've been brewing, it's that homebrewers are a pretty clever lot who come up with pretty interesting solutions to various problems, brewers in general, really. And now, I'm a relatively new believer in the whole cold side oxidation thing. I mean, I kegged hundreds of beers without even worrying about it. But to help, what I've done is I've come to accept that reducing oxygen exposure at the packaging is a very good thing that prolongs the life of beer. I've actually never done the whole continuous purging thing, but it makes sense to me on a practical level. So I look forward to chatting with you about it and the results of your experiment on the topic. Now, if you like what we're up to and you want us to keep doing it, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy by committing to a small monthly pledge over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. You'll receive rewards like access to unpublished recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Our guests for this month are Jeff Daly and Alejandro Gonzalez from Haas. You may recall Jeff from our recent episode focused on Haas's new product called Lupomax. He's the associate sensory scientist at Haas, and Alejandro is the brewing solutions specialist. So if you're into hops at all, you do not want to miss this session. Make sure to make your pledge over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy by September 25th, 2020 to be a part of this event. All past sessions are stored on our private Facebook page, so you can go back and watch them whenever you like. Learn more about becoming a patron over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Another really easy way to support us is by using the links found at brewlosophy.com/support when you're doing your online shopping. It changes nothing in your shopping experience, and we get a small kickback that helps us to keep doing this show. I know it sounds petty, but when you use that, it really does help. So if you could be mindful and do that for us, we'd really appreciate it. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcast, we'd really appreciate it. We're over 700 reviews right now, I believe, which is really cool. So feedback this week is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who specialize in tri-clover compatible sanitary fittings, conical fermenters, kettles, and brew stands. Brewers Hardware offers a variety of unique items for home and craft brewers, including high-quality stainless fittings at great prices with super fast shipping. Learn more at brewershardware.com. And don't forget to mention Brewlosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. That's brewershardware.com. This week, our feedback comes from none other than humble Brewlosophy contributor and co-host of this episode, Cade Jobe. Take it away, Cade.
All right, Cade Jobe writes in, Marshall, I love the podcast and all that we're doing here at Brewlosophy. Let's keep up the good work. On the Brewing with Toasted Oats episode, Jersey and Tim reviewed STS Pils, a Keller Pils from Russian River Brewing Company. Jersey and Tim both said they detected a weed-like character from the beer. You commented that the beer was definitely not skunked, as it had been stored cold in a cooler and was fresh. However, you failed to give Jersey and Tim proper credit for their amazing palates. As you know, Keller Pils is made from the Continental Pilsner malt, which is a distinct aroma that can be misinterpreted as weed-like or skunky. I myself was duped by this subtle difference on a certification test. It is likely that Jersey and Tim identified the Continental Pilsner malt character and, had they described it as such, we would be in awe of their palate prowess. This brings me to another point of feedback that I've wanted to address for some time. Poor Tim has been lambasted for years for describing IPA and hoppier beers as tasting like juniper. Recently, at the brewery, we brewed a grapefruit juniper goza. I was blown away at how similar grapefruit and juniper taste. I had great difficulty separating the two flavors. As you know, grapefruit is a common descriptor of the hop character of IPAs. I believe Tim has been accurately identifying grapefruit character since his first fledgling beer review and has received no credit for his expertise. Jersey and Tim are learned men. They deserve credit where credit is due. Please let them know that they are my heroes. Jersey and Tim, I got you. You stuck it, gents.
Okay. Good points overall, Cade. And what's hilarious to me, listeners, is that Cade actually emailed that to me in the form of feedback. So that's why we had to give Cade credit on this one. But you make good points. I actually never knew until you sent me that email, Cade, that Continental Pilsner is associated with a kind of danky weed-like character. I had no clue. To me, I always just described that as kind of grassy or earthy. But maybe that is what it is. It sounds like you have experience with that, and perhaps it does contribute kind of a cannabis type character to beer. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, so I did mention the certification test there. So on the Cicerone exam, there's one part where you have to taste a beer and describe whether it has an off flavor and identify the off flavor, and then sometimes talk about what you can do to fix it. And one of the beers that was brought was a St. Arnold's Summer Pils, which is their Pilsner model, or their Pilsner style beer that's brewed in the summer here in Texas. And it is a phenomenal Pilsner. It's a classic example of a good continental Pilsner. Even though it's brewed in the United States, it's still a good example of a German Pils.
Sure.
And on the test, I'm going through and I'm tasting the beer and I'm going, oh man, tastes kind of skunky. So, okay, got it. Skunky, off flavor, it's light struck, wrote that down on the test. Turns out, no, it's not. Continental Pilsner actually does have a slightly distinct aroma, like you said, grassy, earthy. It does taste and smell skunky to me, although it's just light. It's really just sulfur, just a touch of sulfur.
Yeah.
And that's what comes across as that weed-like or skunky character for me. And so I got that question totally wrong on the exam, and so did over half of the room. When they did that. So I just thought that was really interesting. And when I heard that, I was like, okay, it's finally time for me to write in. I gotta give Jersey and Tim some credit here.
Well, and credit where, they are getting very good at this thing. And I'm not sure, you made a comment about grapefruit tasting like juniper. I'm still convinced what Tim tastes as juniper is just pine. And he's starting to describe it as more pine-like as well, which I think is really interesting. But Cade, I do appreciate your feedback. If you'd like, if you have feedback that you'd like us to address on the show, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. Speaking of Jersey and Tim, when most people hear Russian River Brewing, they think of Pliny the Elder. It's their delicious double IPA that really spearheaded the style and spent years at the top of most best beer lists. Well, before Pliny was even a thing, brewer Vinny Cilurzo started a brewery down in Temecula, California called Blind Pig, where he made an eponymous IPA that's still highly lauded these days by hopheads the world over.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
Before we even drink this beer, which appears to be quite clear,
It's very clear.
It's got a sour tint to it.
Just by looking at it, you can tell?
Sour tint?
Nah.
And I want to tell you that I love you.
I love you too, Jersey Bird.
No matter what this beer is, it's never going to be as good as me and you, bud.
It's not a sour.
I take it back. This beer is way better than us.
It's an IPA.
This is a good beer. Oh, don't make that
It's
face.
household cleaner.
This is delicious.
Yeah, it's not that good to me.
Nobody gives a all right, people do care what you think. You are
And
a
they
learned
absolutely do
learned man.
But I do not like IPAs. And
This is not an IPA.
it's not, is it?
So what is it, and why don't you like it? I'm not going to be made to look like a fool.
It's got a severe aftertaste.
People don't even want to know what the beer is. They just trust us.
Trust me, this does not taste good.
So tell them why.
It's not good at the beginning, and the end's even worse.
Dude, come on. Yeah.
Nah, I don't like it.
You're going to make us look like fools.
Well, it's like Pine Sol again.
Pine sols and phenols.
It's just not good for me.
It's an IPA.
Okay, I believe I said that, yeah.
It's a thin IPA.
All right, I'll give it that.
It's not a double.
I don't think it's like a full IPA, though.
Yeah, that's an IPA, dude. It's like if you bite into a pine tree.
No, it's very piney.
I tell you, I like it a lot.
I do not like it.
Because you're not learned. You're an unlearned man.
It's not for me. I will drink it though.
So I give it 5 jerseys. What do you think, Tim?
I'm going 1.
Despite not liking it, I have to give Timmy credit for calling out that pine. I mean, he didn't say juniper. It is it's like biting into a pine cone. This is a classic example of a West Coast IPA. I absolutely love it. It's got a little bit more of that malt character, kind of like you would expect from maybe a mid 90s or early 2000s. West Coast IPA. If you've never had it, get your hands on some. It's a delicious beer. Cade, have you ever got to try Blind Pig?
You know, it's embarrassing to say I've never had any Russian River beers. I just have it, living in Texas, they don't get distributed out here. And you have to find them at bottle shops and stuff if you get lucky. And I've never been able to find one. I've never had Pliny the Elder. I've never had STS Pills, and I've never had Blind Pig. But I'm going to have to get out there at some point. Russian River is on my beer bucket list, like I said on the last episode. So I really want to get out there soon and try some of that stuff.
If I was a nice enough friend, I'd send you some, but I hate shipping beer. It's funny because I receive so much beer for these guys to review, but I hate shipping it myself. I totally get why people wouldn't want to do that. But Blind Pig, fantastic beer. Everything Russian River makes is good. So if you can get your hands on it, they are distributing more. We have it here in Fresno now, which is why I was able to serve these guys so much at our last review session. So if you'd like to have your beer or any other fermented beverage reviewed by Jersey and Tim on the show, you can email me, Marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we'll get you all set up. We'll be back to talk about continuous purging with CO2 while kegging after these messages from our sponsors. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Exchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to Exchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. The brew-in-a-bag method has blown up over the last few years, and in that time, it's become very clear that not all bags are created equal. For the best BIAV experience, you have got to go with the Brew Bag. Made from high-quality, food-safe polyester, the Brew Bag is available in both 210 micron for standard brew-in-a-bag, as well as 400 micron, which works beautifully for all-in-one recirculating systems. I've been a Brew Bag user for years and wouldn't brew without it. Head over to brewinabag.com to get the fabric filter that works for you and use promo code TBP17 at checkout to receive a discount. Again, that's brewinabag.com. I hate cold side oxidation. Yes, it's true that I spent years not concerning myself with it at all, just letting the beer from the fermenter flow directly into an open keg, and I was happy with the majority of those beers. But after personally experiencing the negative effects oxygen can have on beer, which has been supported by numerous experiments at this point, I now take the extra effort to ensure my beer has as little contact with oxygen during the packaging process as possible.
Yeah, me too. This one, I should probably update it if I haven't. My contributor bio that talks about what experiments from Brewlosophy have affected the way that I brew today.
Yeah.
And cold side oxidation is definitely one of them. I used to not worry at all about transferring beers from whatever I was fermenting in, whether it was a carboy, a bucket, or the brew buckets that I have from SS Brewtech. I used to not worry at all about getting that. I would just set up a simple racking cane, rack down in there, and not purge the keg, nothing. Just let it go.
It's funny. There's those experiments. I think we get viewed often as being a group of guys whose experiments have made it less stressful for people to brew, if you will. They're not paying as much attention to certain parts of the process. But I would say that the biggest impact our experiments have been on my packaging process and my concern. It's actually made me more stressed when I'm packaging because I want my beer to taste good. We do these short and shoddy brews all the time, and one of the things that people will comment on is, well, it's not very shoddy when you're packaging into a purged keg. The whole purpose of short and shoddy is to make the best beer possible using, the least stressful methods, but that best beer possible is still a part of it. And so there's a reason I mind cold side oxidation in packaging with as little oxygen exposure as possible. Now, this episode is going to be, heavily focused on kegging. So if you're a bottler, that's good. I think you can still get some good information, but we are going to be talking about the process of racking from one vessel, the fermenter, into a keg. I suppose some people might use the same process for racking into a bottling bucket. But that's, when you're bottling, it's very difficult to avoid, fully avoid oxygen exposure, at least in my experience.
Yeah. Bottling is a whole different can of worms in terms of oxygen ingress. There are still ways that you can limit it whenever you're bottling. Purging the bottles, if you use a beer gun or a counterflow filler, or, even just shoot some CO2 down in there, through an open hose. There's ways to eliminate it. But yeah, this episode's going to focus on kegging and getting getting as much oxygen out of the keg as you need to. But I guess first we should probably start by talking about kegs, right?
Yeah, kegs in general, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, there's kind of two basic types of kegs that we as homebrewers use, which is the corny keg, ball lock, and pin locks, and then there's the commercial version, which are Sankey. At least here in the United States, the commercial version of kegs are Sankey kegs, and they're really not that different, except for the way that you get beer into the keg. I mean, the ball lock and pin locks obviously look a lot different than the Sankey kegs. Ball lock and pin lock are just old, either Coca-Cola or Pepsi kegs that have sometimes been cleaned before they're resold. Sometimes
often not, yeah.
Often not. Yeah, but then they're pretty easy to clean though. They've got a big lid on the inside that you can open up. You can get your arm down in there, or get with a water hose and a sponge and get them pretty cleaned up. So that's an easy way to start, and they're relatively cheap. Ball locks and pin lock kegs. I mean, pin lock kegs for a while they were going like $20 or $25 a keg. Oh yeah. I don't know if they're still that cheap, but you can still find kegs for $25, $30, $40, to do that.
The thing about corny kegs that is nice, it's kind of its pro is also its con when it comes to the topic that we're talking about. That nice big lid on the top makes it easy enough to clean. Some of the tricks people use is shoving a toilet wand brush down in there and cleaning it out with that, and it makes it nice. But also, if you're not careful, that opening allows a lot of oxygen in during the kegging process. I've never actually kegged in a Sankey keg. I've used Sankey kegs multiple times. You're at Blue Owl, so you see regular Sankey kegs all the time. How exactly does that work, anyways?
Yeah. So I see Sankey kegs all the time. It's a much smaller opening. It's maybe 2 inches or 3 inches. No, it's not. Yeah, probably like 2 inches in diameter. So there's no way to get down in the keg unless you take the actual core out of the keg, and that requires there's a little metal O-ring in the top that you have to kind of wrench out and pull out. Then you can get down in there and actually inspect what's in the keg. It's still really hard, if not impossible, to get your hand. You can't get your hand into the keg. You may be able to get some sort of
yeah.
Yeah, you may be able to get like a brush along bottle brush a carboy brush if you flattened it out. You might be able to get something like that down in there, but you're really just not going to be able to get a brush down in that Sankey keg. Obviously at the brewery, I think at our brewery and most commercial breweries, we have a keg washer, which is basically a clean in place system that, rinses it with caustic solution, lets it sit, rinses that all out, then sanitizes it, and then evacuates the sani, and then purges the keg. That's a really fast way of talking about the process of getting beer into the keg, which we'll go into a little bit more. If you're home brewing with Sankey kegs, you can do it. You can transfer, through the Sankey device and purge pretty easily. It's just you don't know if there's anything in the keg. I think it'd be a real pain to clean the Sankeys. So most homebrewers probably are using ball locks and pin locks, even though it is possible to use Sankeys.
The corny kegs are by far the most popular option for homebrewers. Plus, they're 5 gallons as opposed to half barrel, which is nice. 15 and a half gallons is a lot of beer to have on hand as a homebrewer, if it's the same beer, especially. So when I first started kegging, which I thought it must have been 8 years ago now. I've been doing this for a long time. When I first started kegging, it didn't even cross my mind to use any other method for getting that beer into the keg than, having a tube, some beer tube from either my siphon or from the valve on my fermenter. And I would just drop that down into the bottom of the Cornelius keg. And then I would open up the valve, or I would start the siphon and let it fill from the bottom up. And the common saying back then was, or the common belief, I should say, is that when you do that, any residual carbon dioxide that's in that beer will create a layer above the beer that the oxygen will stay above, and then it will push the oxygen out if you're filling from the bottom of the keg. Do you remember that being a common belief?
Oh, yeah. Oh, I totally remember that. I remember I remember everybody talking about that, saying that, oh yeah, somehow the CO2 that's in solution from the beer is going to just create this layer of gas that sits on top of the beer that you're racking in. Unfortunately, that's just not how ideal gas laws work. Gases readily mix, and you've got air sitting on the top up there, so air is not just oxygen. Obviously, it's a bunch of oxygen and nitrogen, and anyway, I mean, you've got that sitting on the top, and that's what's actually making contact with the beer. Even if there is some CO2 coming out of solution, it's coming up and then mixing with the air and floating away.
Yeah, it's not this like solid magical barrier that's gonna keep the air from mixing in with it. Arguably, I get another one of the things that people would talk about was in doing that the volume of beer as it rises, that's staying relatively stable, and so as it pushes up, you're not actually getting much contact with oxygen. So if you're quick enough, then you do that, and then you can purge the headspace or something like that and get that oxygen out of there, and then you should be good to go. I've had experiences mostly with hoppy beers. I don't care if it's New England IPA or West Coast Clear IPA, where after about a week in the keg, it starts to get caramely. It starts to take on that obvious oxidation character, and it's terrible. And that's the only thing I could associate that with, and why I started minding cold side oxidation during packaging, is because I don't like that. I don't want it to taste like that. So the first step for me, I'm curious what your evolution in kegging has been like, Cade. The first step for me was actually an idea I saw, back when Ray was brewing for Brewlosophy. Ray found, I started noticing in his photos that he had a disconnect and he would keg his beer into through the liquid line, through the liquid post, the beer post on his keg. And that way, there was less vigorous action. It was much smoother. It was gently going into the bottom of the keg, but it still relied on the same idea that, that beer is going to push the air up and out of the kegs. But I did that for a couple of years before even considering other options to reduce cold side oxidation.
Yeah, I mean, I started probably the same way that you did. I mean, like most homebrewers, I started bottling. I didn't go straight to kegs, so I was already racking into a bottling bucket and then racking out of the bottling bucket into bottles. So it didn't even, like you said, it didn't even occur to me that there are different ways to keg other than just do the same thing, rack it out of the fermenter directly into the open lid of the keg using your hose, just kind of push it down to the bottom. And there's one thing I wanted to say about that real quick, is there's there's a couple things that happen when you're racking beer into the keg. And one of them is that not just that there's air that's sitting on top of the beer, it's that there's turbulence at the point of contact. So the beer's swirling around in there and it's mixing. And so any gas that's contacting that liquid barrier is actually mixing into the beer at that gas liquid barrier. Now, it's based on turbulence. So if you're just literally dumping your beer into the keg, that creates a lot of turbulence and you're going to get a lot of gas mixed in. If it's just gently swirling around, there's probably not that much, gas that's going to get mixed in. But there is a little bit. And same thing when we're talking about the top of the fermenter, right? The top of the fermenter is creating a suckback. So the top of the fermenter is also creating a little turbulence as it's going down, as the beer level's going down, and air's coming in that way. So, those couple of things, like I noticed it first in hoppy beers.
Yeah.
And especially like you said, those West Coast IPAs, when I'd make this beer and it was wonderful. It tasted great. And then about 2 weeks later, it just is caramely and thick.
Yeah.
And the color has changed and it no longer has hop character. It's not as bitter. And I just started noticing all these problems. And that was about the time that I think, Brewlosophy came out with some of those experiments. So I eventually switched to like what Ray was doing, which was kegging down the liquid out tube, just going in that way. Mm-hmm. And then I realized, hey, well, if I'm doing that, maybe I could, and I saw some things online, maybe I can purge the keg first and then just, release the pressure on the gas outpost, but maybe just fill the keg with CO2. Does that do anything? And it turns out, yeah, it actually does quite a bit. So,
well, yeah. And that's the other thing when, as this became more of a concern, and I think, there have been people who have been preaching the goodness of purging kegs and all of that for years. We did not invent the idea, and we don't take credit for that. We have definitely experimented with it and have been convinced. I think all of us have been convinced that it matters. I think probably the most common approach that I'm seeing these days, perhaps this is just bias because it's what I do, is, you fill the keg with sanitizer and then you push that out with CO2 either from fermentation, that's what I've been doing lately, so naturally produced CO2, or through your standard tank, your standard CO2 tank. And then you rack the beer into that through the liquid out, and then you relieve the pressure on the keg however you choose to do that. I just use either a little plastic depressor, or you can use an extra disconnect. But then you're filling into ostensibly a keg that has zero oxygen or very, very low oxygen in it, and it works really well. We've done a lot of experiments on that. The interesting thing is that there's been some, you've got some people out there who are also saying, well, you don't even need to do that if you just, fill the thing with CO2, purge the keg, hit it with the empty keg, hit it with CO2 again, empty it. You can get away with that, and people are reporting good results. To me, that seems, again, gases mix. And so it's interesting to me that if that is going to work, what's happening to this whole gases mix argument? Are you just every purge? Are you getting rid of more oxygen and eventually it gets low enough to where it doesn't have an impact? I don't know. But your idea, and I'd like to hear about what you guys are doing at Blue Owl, because your idea and kind of the impetus for this experiment we're going to talk about was to continuously purge not just the keg while you're filling it. The idea there being, right, to have so much CO2 that the oxygen barrier isn't going to, or the barrier is strong enough that oxygen will get pushed out, but also to purge the fermentation vessel as you're racking out of it.
Yeah. So the argument about the gases mixing, so CO2 is an inert gas, which means that it doesn't react very strongly with other things. Like, for example, O2, CO2 and O2 don't really react, which is like we're breathing out CO2 right now and nothing is combusting or turning into acid rain with our breath. So CO2 and O2 don't readily react with each other, which means they don't bind and form new particles, but they do sort of mix together. CO2 is an inert gas and it's still heavier than oxygen, so it will sit at the bottom if you're continuously replenishing it, right? If you're continuously pushing CO2 in. So that's how those closed pressure transfer systems work. When we're purging, a keg. So the whole point of purging is to get the oxygen out of the keg. And the way you do that is by injecting CO2. So if you think about this in two ways, one of them is, let's say you've got 100% oxygen, or you've got 100% air in your keg, right? And then you start pushing CO2 in there and letting some of that come out, right? That means some percentage of air is coming out along with some percentage of CO2 is coming out. So something is changing. Now the concentration of that mix that's inside your keg is changing. And the cool thing about CO2 and it being an inert gas and the fact that it's slightly heavier than O2 is that it will settle to the bottom of the keg, especially if you're purging at the bottom or under high pressure. So that'll settle out to the bottom, and the first thing that comes out is that air. And then it's just a matter of the amount of time and pressure that you do in order to purge. What I mean by that is the number of times that you actually fill the keg and then release out the pressure and the pressure at which you do it. So if you do it at 1 psi, you're not putting that much CO2 into the keg, so it's going to take a long time for CO2 to get out. If you do it at 50 psi, you're putting a lot of CO2 in that keg really quickly that's going straight to the bottom, and then it's going to push that air out more quickly, so you don't have to do it as many times.
Yeah. So that and it makes sense, right? CO2, you mentioned it, is heavier than oxygen, not that much heavier, but it is heavier than oxygen. So theoretically, if you have enough CO2 sitting at the bottom of a keg before you start racking the beer in there, it sort of makes sense to me that barrier is going to be big enough that even with the mixing that is going to occur because of the turbulence created from that beer being transferred into the keg, that it may be thick enough to keep the top of that beer coming into the keg away from any oxygen exposure. At the same time, I just don't know how. I've seen colored demonstrations on YouTube and stuff of CO2 and oxygen and how gases mix when they come into contact. I just don't. It's a tough one for me to wrap my head around how it wouldn't mix at least enough for oxygen to expose it, but maybe it's just not enough for it to have a negative impact, or maybe it slows the aging or the staling process down. I don't know, but one of the thoughts that I had with this continuous purging idea that you tested is, if you're letting now correct me if I'm wrong, you're letting CO2 go in rather than transferring through the beer line on your keg, the beer post, the liquid outpost, you're connecting gas there and then flowing that in gently through the bottom. And then you're putting a tube into your keg and gently filling the keg up from the bottom. Is that how that works, or?
Yes. So the impetus for this was I saw a transfer from barrels into a keg. And one of the things that we did, we don't have a bulldog, which is a way to, put a CO2 and liquid transfer thing. It's a way to pressurize a barrel and keep it sealed whenever you're transferring from barrels. So all we have is a simple gravity-fed siphon. So we're pulling the barrels up on a forklift and running some hose in it from the barrel into the kegs. Now, we are getting rid of those beers pretty quickly. Those are usually special releases that we're doing, and they usually sell out fast enough. So we're not too worried about oxygen, but we are worried about it, and you don't want oxygen to get in and stick around in that package. So one of the things that we do at Blue Owl is we'll run CO2 into the top of the open barrels, just in case, and sort of mix it and purge. So the idea is we're constantly running CO2 in at pressure, which means we're constantly pushing CO2 in, pushing it in, pushing it in, pushing it in, and it's pushing that air out. So even though it's mixing, we're still increasing the concentration of CO2 in that space.
Right.
So that's the idea, and is to keep, sort of like you said, not necessarily a blanket of CO2, but keep the concentration of CO2 high enough that we're not just having air in there mixing with the beer.
Yeah.
So going into the barrel at the top, which is being racked out of, right? And as that level goes down, we're sort of moving the tube down over into a purged keg. That was the idea for this experiment is, okay, well, what if people don't have a closed pressure transfer system? They don't have an ability to push beer from their fermenter into a purged keg, so they're exposing the fermenter to air and potentially exposing the open keg to air, depending on their equipment or processes.
Yeah.
That was the idea for this is, well, what if there's a way that we could actually put CO2 in both places using a tube and keep that I hate to say CO2 blanket because that's not exactly right, but keep the CO2 concentration high enough that we're not getting oxygen dissolving into the solution as we're doing the rack.
Yeah, I love it. And the more we talk about it, one of the things that I'm thinking is that when I purge a keg, when I push Star San, a full keg of Star San, I push that out. It doesn't matter what the PSI is. It's going to take a specific amount of gas to push that keg out. Well, every keg I purge that way is one keg less that I can use my CO2 tank on, right? To push beer out of. So it would seem to me that a gentle flow of CO2 going into the keg, you could keep that PSI down low enough to where you've got that barrier that keeps the oxygen concentration low enough you could potentially conserve a little bit more CO2. I don't know. You wouldn't have to use as much if you keep the PSI low enough. It seems to me.
Yeah, sure. And you don't need much PSI. You just need positive pressure. So positive pressure is 1 or 2 PSI of CO2, so such that will continue to purge. That's why, again, we call it continuously purging, everything. So we're pushing that CO2 out using positive pressure. So yeah, you don't need very much to do it. You're not wasting a lot of CO2 by just pushing it. Now, it depends on how long it takes you to transfer. If you're using, 3/16 beer line, that's going to take a long time to transfer that beer out. But I use 1/2-inch line whenever I'm transferring from a fermenter because I just try to get it in there as quick as possible. Yeah. Again, I'm using a closed system right now, so the 1/2-inch line is going to create a lot of turbulence because there's a lot more flow, flows a lot faster into the keg.
Yeah.
So if I weren't using a closed system, like for example, if I were doing this method on normal kegging runs, then I would be using a much smaller inner diameter thickness so that it's slower and we're not creating as much turbulence.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that's the idea, right?
Yeah, and it makes sense to me. You touched on it. I don't think we focused too much on it though. This idea that when the beer is leaving the fermenter, something needs to take its place, and when you don't do anything, it's air. I mean, if everybody who's ever racked out of a carboy with an airlock on top has seen, the air getting sucked through that airlock, and that could potentially again impact the beer, or at least touch the beer and impact it negatively further on down the line. And so one of the things that you did as well, and when we're talking about this continuous purging, is that this process, you basically split off your CO2 line. One went into the keg and then one went into the top of the fermentation vessel, right?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I attached one line to the CO2. I had a splitter. So two hoses coming off of the same tank, ran one line up to the top of the fermenter and slowly moving that line down so that it's just above the top level of beer on the fermenter as it goes out of the fermenter. And then a second line into the keg with just the lid open into the keg, filling through the dip tube. So the beer is flowing through the dip tube down into the bottom of the keg. And then I'm just raising the CO2 line up the keg as beer flows into the keg, just to keep it, like a 1/4 of an inch or a 1/2 an inch above the top of the beer.
Yeah.
Try to keep that continuous purge going. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a method that I've never done, and it may sound like, oh, you got 2 lines, it's complicated. This is as simple as it gets. I mean, all you're doing is turning a valve on your CO2 tank and then moving some tubing. So,
I mean, this is a method that was really interesting to me. So it's just something that I thought might be fun to check out.
Absolutely. Well, I've used a number of different methods to reduce oxygen exposure when kegging, though I've never continuously run CO2 into the keg and fermentation vessel at the same time. Curious to see how effective this approach is. We put it to the test. Results when we're back from this break. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all-grain beer in a single, compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high-quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to Grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to Grainfather.com, that's Grainfather.com, and get started today.
Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD, that's BRUPOD, at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. Well, like me, Cade, you've come to acknowledge that oxygen is the enemy of beer and employ methods to reduce exposure as much as possible when you're kegging. Recently, you tested one of these methods out.
Yeah, so this method was, again, the point of this was to check the continuous purging. And so we wanted to do a IPA. And in this case, we did sort of a New England IPA because that's what we always hear is that, hops are sensitive to oxygen, which is true. And those are the ones where we see the greatest difference in our experiments here at Brewlosophy in terms of cold side oxidation is with those hoppy beers. So we picked an IPA. So I brewed a single batch of IPA, fairly high content of flaked oats and wheat malt, but otherwise normal. So I did 64% pale, 18% flaked oats, and 18% wheat malt. But again, I think that's totally in style if you're looking for a New England IPA.
Yeah, well, and there's an interesting, this is a little side note here on why IPA is so sensitive to oxygen. If you read the new IPA by Scott Janish, I've talked to Scott about this before, there are certain things, compounds, whatever, heavy metals, if you will, in flaked adjunct that seem to potentially contribute. There's not a lot of real hard science on this, but to this quick oxidizing of beer. One of those is manganese, and I believe flaked oats has a relatively high amount of manganese when you're comparing it to other cereal grains. And then you blend that with a high amount of hops, which I believe also contains some manganese, but also has other oxidative compounds in them. And that's one of the theories as to why hoppier beers tend to oxidize a bit faster. Cade, I don't know if you know any more about that, but I can speak to kegging myriad, blonde ales or brown ales or amber ales or pilsners using less, safe, oxygen reducing methods, and they come out fine and they even last a while. But you do an IPA like that, and within a week, like we talked about earlier, they're just gone.
Yeah, and another shout out for Scott's book, The New IPA. That's a fantastic it's amazing book, yeah. Especially if you love the science. He goes into so many different scientific papers and publications that were written on everything that you would need to know about hops. A fantastic book. If you don't have that in your library and you like sciencey things, you need to get that and read it. But yeah, that's totally right. Manganese and some other things in there. I mean, we didn't talk about it too much in the first episode because this wasn't really, or in the other segment, because this wasn't really a talk about oxidation. But yeah, it mixes with a bunch of things. Polyphenols are a big one, which obviously we know come from hops. It mixes with fatty acids and all those other things, which create staling and, perceived reduction of bitterness and all that. But if you want more information on that stuff, absolutely go check out Scott's book. There's a whole chapter. I'm pretty sure it's a whole chapter that's dedicated just to that issue.
Yeah.
So I mashed the beer at 150 F or 66 C for 60 minutes, boiled it for 60 minutes, and then added hops. I did a 14-gram charge of Magnum at 16 minutes, and then I did 14 grams each of Centennial, Citra, Laurel, and Mosaic at both 5 and 1 minute. I love that blend of hops.
That sounds amazing, man. Yeah, that's a great blend.
Yeah. And then, so after the boil, both the worts were chilled before taking a final gravity an original gravity reading, which came out at the intended 1.058, which is perfect.
Beautiful.
For an IPA. So then I evenly split the wort between 2 SS brew buckets and pitched single pouches of Imperial Yeast A07 flagship into each batch. Then I fermented the beers at 66F or 19C, and after a couple of weeks, they had finished and both achieved the FG of 1.004.
That's a low FG, man.
Yeah, I know. It did really well. Oh, I skipped over the dry hop. I did 28 grams of Citra, Laurel, and Mosaic at 5 days. But yeah, 1.004. That's a nice dry, nice tasting IPA. So I'm pretty excited about it.
So at this point, the beers are identical. I mean, you right now, all you did is you brewed a 10-gallon batch of beer. You fermented them in separate fermenters. They finished at the same gravity. Everything about them at this point was identical. You check the FG and you tell yourself it's time to put these in kegs. And this is where the variable was introduced.
Yeah. So this is the variable. And as we talked about just in the last segment, this will be exactly where I talk about what I did. So first of all, before packaging, I always sanitize my kegs, which hopefully everybody's doing that. But I didn't purge the kegs. So this is different than what I would consider my normal method. I just sanitized the kegs and left them upside down to dry for a little bit. Both kegs then, I attached liquid hoses, liquid inlet hoses to the dip tube liquid line of the keg. So racking from the fermenter to the liquid line in the kegs, and left the lid off of both batches. So There was no purge. There's no CO2 in it. It's just full of air. So then on one of the batches, I took the CO2, I put a splitter on it, and then ran one hose up into the airlock hole of the brew bucket. And then I put the other end of the CO2 into the top of the keg, so that the hoses were just a little bit above the keg, like I mentioned in the last segment.
Yeah.
Set the gas to about 2 psi, and then opened the valve on the brew buckets. So the idea was, I also used sort of gravity on this one. I didn't use any CO2 to push. So gravity was on this one, which was nice because I wanted to get a little bit of turbulence, but not too much. And again, I used 1/2-inch beer lines on this. So that beer flowed really quickly, which I think created enough turbulence that if this was going to, if we were going to emphasize the variable on this, that's the way we needed to do it. So again, one of them has hoses that are continuously purging CO2 into the top of the fermenter and the top of the keg. The other one has absolutely no oxygen control. It's just open to the air, both the fermenter and on the keg.
Yeah, it seems like I'm as you're talking about this, I'm thinking, man, maybe just doing what I normally do and filling a keg and pushing it out is about the same amount of work. But it seems like a valid. Again, you're running CO2 into the keg. You're creating a higher concentration of CO2 than presumably than oxygen. It shouldn't. That beer, when it's flowing in, shouldn't have much contact with oxygen, or so it seems to me. So it's really simple. I was just trying to explain it in enough detail so that people can actually see it. I think if you look at the pictures online, it's super simple. You're just putting your 2 ends of the CO2 line into the one in the fermenter, one in the keg, and that's really it. That's the only difference. The difference here is for a lot of people don't have, like, if you're coming out of a carboy, for example, this would be a great way to purge the top of that carboy of CO2.
CO2. Obviously, you can't pressure transfer out of a carboy. Well, there are methods. I don't I don't recommend them. I've never used them, but most people aren't pressure transferring out of carboy. So if you do have a carboy and that's how you're getting out, you can just run that CO2 line in there and then into your keg. And maybe that will help you.
Or, even more so with a bucket, if you're using a bucket and you're putting a racking cane in the top of that bucket, flowing a bit of CO2, just running some CO2 down into the bucket for maybe a minute before you start racking out, and then keeping that flow, it seems to me like a decent way of reducing, at the very least, any exposure that beer may have to oxygen during the packaging process. So makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. So got both beers. Both kegs filled with beer. So I filled the kegs. I burst carbonated. I did not purge either keg. So that's also something that I would normally do, is purge the keg of CO2. But again, I wanted
the headspace you're talking about, right?
Correct.
Once you get it full, okay.
Yeah, correct. The headspace. So with the one that was continuously purged, just had the lid ready, had the CO2 hose in there continuously purging, took the hose out, put the lid on as fast as I could. The other one was just continue open to air. So hopefully there was CO2 in the CO2 purge one, but who knows? It was, again, not trying to purge either of them, just trying to keep the variable as consistent as I could.
No, I love it. And then the other thing that I really appreciate that you did with this one is once they were, one of the biggest comments that you'll get, and it doesn't matter how long we wait. If you collect data a week after the beers were kegged, people will say, well, you got to leave them longer. It's the differences aren't going to show when you leave beer only for a week in the keg. But then we leave it for 4 weeks. People are like, well, the beer wasn't fresh. You got to drink the beer fresh. This one, it made a lot of sense to me for you to wait on data collection. And you did that. You let these beers sit in the keg for a whole month, for 4 weeks before you started collecting data. The idea there being allowing time for that oxygen to have its effect, right? To take a hold of this beer. And if there is oxygen exposure, for it to negatively impact the beer.
Yeah, absolutely. So let it condition for 4 weeks, give it a good amount of time to let the oxygen impact the beer. This one, that's exactly what I did. Let it condition for 4 weeks before taking some samples of it myself and then serving it to tasters.
So tell us, before we talk about the tasters, now I will say this was one of the weird experiments where you had collected a good amount of data and then quarantine happened. And so you couldn't finish data collection. But before we talk about that, tell us about your experience with these beers when you did your series of semi-blind triangle tests.
Yeah, so this one was interesting because there was what I would call initial observations, and then there were 4-week observations, and then long-term observations, which were just mine. But the initial observations straight into the kegs after burst carbonating, like day 1 or 2, I didn't really notice any difference in the beers. I didn't do any blind triangle tests. This was just me comparing it, totally biased, side by side, and didn't notice any difference. But I did eventually start to notice things. The first thing that happened is the beer that was continuously purged started to drop a little bit clearer than the beer that wasn't continuously purged. And I was surprised by this because what I expected to see was a color change. And I didn't see a color change, at least in the first 4 weeks. But I did see slightly clearer. Having done more research on this, I now know that actually that is something that oxidation can do too. Oxidation can contribute to haze.
Really?
That was something I didn't know either until after this experiment. So that seems like maybe some evidence that there was a little bit more oxygen exposure in the beer that wasn't continuously purged. But the real difference happened at about 6 weeks. And I don't have any photos of this, but the real difference, the color started to change, started to get a strong honey character from the non-continuously purged beer. And it got stale and gross. It's just a way to say it.
Yeah, it is gross. And so that's interesting because already in your own personal, completely biased observation, you're looking and saying, wow, the continuous purging seems to have done something good. And by the way, very interesting. I'm just learning now that oxidation can impact clarity as well. I didn't know that. But that is interesting because in your own triangle test, I believe you got 3 out of 6 attempts right, but that just speaks to your ability to distinguish these beers, blind or semi-blind in this case, but you saw with your own eyes the impact of the oxidation. And that to me is already speaking to the positives of continuously purging the keg and the fermenter while packaging,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And I mean, when I did my attempts, that was at about 3 weeks of them aging. So my attempts were at about 3 weeks, and that's where I got it about 3 out of 6. So, they were still surprisingly similar, although 50%, that's still better than random guessing on my attempts. So, yeah.
You were at 4 weeks in the keg when you served them to 16 participants. You were at a Zealots meeting?
Yeah, this was actually the last Zealots meeting before COVID. So
you served them to 16 Zealots, which is awesome. Just 4 away from our normal standards. So we went ahead and ran with these results, given the where we thought we were back in the beginning of this whole quarantine thing. But 16, you would have needed 9 to identify the odd beer out in the triangle test in order for us to say that it was significant. And in the end, how many actually were able to distinguish that unique sample?
So we had 11, which was 69% of the people who tasted the beer. So that's significant. People were able to reliably tell the beers apart.
Yeah, I mean, that's, again, 69%. That's a good chunk of people who have no idea about the variable that's being tested. They weren't told anything about the beer. And they were able to pick it out in a triangle test. I would say that is pretty strong evidence that continuously purging during the packaging process with CO2 does have an impact. And I love knowing that you can rely on this method. Maybe you forget to purge the Star San way or whatever, but you can rely on this method to hopefully positively impact the beer. Now, whenever there's a significant result, we do ask tasters to pick of the 2 beers that are different. We don't tell them what it is, what the variable is or anything like that, but we do ask them to say which one they preferred. Oddly enough, 4 people preferred the continuously purged beer, while 7 liked the non-purged beer more. If anything, that just speaks to the subjectivity of preference, in my opinion.
Yeah. I mean, and I would say, at 4 weeks, again, my own personal experience was around 6 weeks is when the non-purged beer really tanked. So yeah. I think we were starting to get some flavor differences here, but we didn't have necessarily all of the impact that had hit yet. Yeah. But still, I mean, 7 people liked the non-purged beer more. 4 people preferred the continuously purged beer. That's not a huge difference. It's almost half of them, more than half of them that got it significant that liked the non-purged beer. But again, I don't read too much into these preference details on this one.
Yeah, I actually read very little into it, but people like to see that data, so we give it to them. Like I said, though, it sounds like this is a process that is it works. And if it's something that you want to try or you want to use, you're probably going to do, or your beer is probably going to be less oxidized than if you don't do it, and so I think it's a valid approach, and I find these results pretty interesting. To be honest, I had my hangups about this one because of the whole gases mix thing, and the fact that it came back significant really did surprise me. So I think that's pretty neat.
Yeah, this one definitely surprised me. I was glad to see that, hey, if we're doing this at the brewery, it seems like here's some evidence to support why we do that. This one was good. And I would say, going forward, again, I have a closed pressure transfer system. So I didn't change my brewing practices based on this experiment, because why would I do that? Why would I expose the beer to oxygen or to air at all when I have a completely closed system?
Yeah.
But this is for people that don't necessarily have the ability to pressure transfer. This is an opportunity for you if you are experiencing those oxidation characters, especially in your hoppier beers. This is an opportunity to use this method to control that. Now, I will caveat one last thing. Like Marshall said earlier, this was only 16 participants because this was in the middle of March, right whenever things were starting to shut down. We still achieved significant results, but the power of this experiment wasn't super strong. So maybe don't read into it too much. But if this works for you and is a method that works for your equipment, it's definitely evidence to support using this method to keep oxidation minimized in your beers. So.
Yeah, well put. I agree with that. I've lately been using naturally produced CO2 to purge kegs. So I have a keg that just basically I keep one keg full of star sand, and then when I'm fermenting a beer, I attach. It's a fun little setup that's way simpler than it sounds, but I attach a line from the fermenter to the gas post on the full keg of star sand. And then I connect the liquid post from that keg to an empty keg's liquid post. And I put a PRV, some sort of a pressure relief on the gas post of that second keg. And then I push the star sand using naturally produced CO2 into that second keg. So for me, I always have a purged keg sitting around, and it's just this constant train. I'm constantly doing that. So it makes no sense for me to even open that keg up when I'm transferring into it. So I won't be using this method, but I do think it's interesting nonetheless. And we did get some reader comments on this one. We'll start with Myron Olson's comment. He said, we always gravity drain the fermented beer into a keg that has been purged with CO2. The O2 that was in the keg has escaped, leaving what is basically an O2 free environment. Never had any issues or problems related to oxygen.
Yeah, and so I think this is something that a lot of people do. It's probably pretty close to an O2 related environment. This is what I would say is sort of a hybrid of the way that I did it. One thing that you could do is purge your keg, completely purge your keg, seal it off, and then like Marshall put a PRV or something on the gas outpost to release pressure.
Yeah.
But then still keep that line going in the top of the keg or in the top of the fermenter.
Yeah.
To keep the CO2 off of the top of the, at least continue purging the CO2 into the top of the fermenter. But I think this is what a lot of people are doing these days. And this was something that I'd like to explore sort of in the future, see if it's even worth it to keep CO2 going in the top of the fermenter.
I do it. I mean, that's one thing I absolutely do when I'm kegging nowadays is I attach some form of gas, CO2 to the fermenter, because I don't want any oxygen touching the beer,
Yeah, exactly.
One, I want to comment. He said he's never had any issues or problems related to oxygen, and I'm not questioning Myron's palate or anything like that. I was convinced of the same thing until I had a noticeable problem, and that was when I started to kind of accept this concept that maybe most of my beers and have been oxidized on some level, and it's just not bothered me. They've still tasted good, and that's a great thing. I've come to the belief that there are certain styles where you can get away with a little bit of oxidation and it's not going to be an issue. You might even win competitions with those beers. But when it comes to hoppy beer in particular, you can't get away with it. It's terrible. It literally takes away from the hop character, which is exactly what you don't want to do. So just to comment on maybe you haven't noticed the problems yet, but maybe they're there. Who knows? Comment by Martin Peterson. This is an interesting one I'd like to hear your response to, Cade. He says, hi, IBU, and the IPA was specifically designed to not go stale. Try a low IBU, any IPA, and enjoy your brown stale sludge.
I'm not sure what he means by the high IBU having anything to do with it. I'm not sure. I have certainly have had low IBU. I mean, this one was fairly low. I don't remember what the actual IBUs on this was, but it was probably in the 40s. I mean, most of my NE IPAs are around that level. I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that. by the IBU having an impact. Certainly, polyphenols and other hop material can certainly have an impact. I'm not sure about IBU, but if you're listening to this, Martin, and have some additional information, I'd love to read about it.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what he means by you specifically designing the recipe to not go stale. I feel like if you are designing an IPA recipe, you're almost designing a recipe that is going to go stale unless you take certain measures, So
all beer goes stale at some point. If you've got it, there's dissolved oxygen in solution that remains in there from the fermenter, and at some point all beer will go stale.
Yeah,
but. Yeah, I mean, we obviously try to minimize staleness. I don't know that I designed the recipe with staleness, except, knowing that it's got a lot of hop material in it. But I guess we'll like I said, Martin, if you've got any additional information, email it in. I'd love to read it.
Yeah. Also, the experiment was significant. People could taste the difference. So anyways, we'll move on. Yeah. Final comment comes from Reddit user Warboy. He had a comment on the whole preference thing. He said, "It's my firm belief that consumers have been conditioned to like or at least tolerate slightly oxidized beer. With the influx of small atmospheric canners and pro breweries and dissolved oxygen levels above 100 ppb, that's parts per billion, being the norm for a very long time, people have just developed a taste for it. Beyond that, oxidation only really negatively affects beer at extreme levels when it becomes iced tea-like, cardboardy, and all the hops are gone. The oxidized beer probably just had more body to back up a highly hopped beer."
Oh man, I wish I could remember where I saw this. There was a graph that essentially looked at 6 or 7 different characteristics of stale beer, or like what those stale flavors taste like. Because oxygen mixes with a bunch of things. It's not just one thing that oxygen mixes with and that causes stale beer. It mixes with a bunch of stuff. Fatty acids from malt, polyphenols from hops, alcohol itself, all of those things, and they create different compounds based on what the individual alcohol was or what fatty acid it mixed with and all this. But this graph essentially showed when the different flavors hit and hit their peak, when they spike, when they go off, or when they taper off, or when they increase over time. And if I remember correctly, honey was the flavor that continued to increase over the length of time that the beer sat. Cardboard and papery kind of did a reverse parabola where it spiked up really high and then spiked down pretty quickly within a span of a few weeks. So that graph was really interesting to me and showed me a lot of how oxidation character is perceived. Honey, to me, is how I identify oxidation character. If a beer tastes like honey, that's how I can distinguish that it's stale or oxidized. That's just a sweet character. So for most people, that honey may not be off-putting at all, and in fact, in certain beers, it may actually increase the preference for that beer. So I think it's hard to say that the preference, stuff in this beer. It's hard to say that people are conditioned to oxidized beer. Maybe they were. Maybe that's absolutely true. But I think also it depends on, one, the oxidation character that's coming through, and 2, what it actually is. Honey, I don't think is a very terribly off-putting flavor for a lot of people. So
for me, what is a terribly off-putting flavor is that hard candy, which they're not, those aren't too disparate. I mean, honey is a sweet candy-like flavor, hard candy obviously, but there's this like weird, like old, took it out of grandma's little glass bowl candy flavor that I get from oxidized IPA in particular. And I think it's that fruitiness from the hops blended with that weird sweetness that is just so incredibly displeasing to me. I hate it. But I like what Warboy's saying. And I think he's right. I think, and goes for more than just oxidation. You talk to people who were homebrewing way back in the day, and that twang that people used to talk about, that homebrew twang, that was a desirable thing for some people because it's what they knew. It's that was what they learned was, quote unquote, good homebrew. And that we are this weird species that adapts our thinking based on what's available to us. And it makes sense that people would, if that's what they grew up drinking, that they would think that was good. And I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with it, but this idea that oxidation has become something that at least the American palate has grown, not to necessarily appreciate and enjoy, but to not really care that much about, makes sense to me, at least. So I appreciate the comment, Warboy. Well, that does bring us to the end of this episode. Cade, do you have anything else on continuously purging the keg and fermenter with CO2 and packaging?
No, I hope this was a useful experiment for people that aren't able to pressure transfer or that are just looking for different ways to control oxidation. And if you have any questions about any of this, just shoot me an email. I'll be happy to respond. Very well, man. Well, don't forget you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article on brewlosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman, no more.